Hi everyone, my name is Jordan. I'm a junior sociology major at Arcadia University, and my project is on the strategic shifting of the boundaries of whiteness throughout U.S. history. I just realized I forgot my note cards. Thank you. So my argument is that white people are conscious of their whiteness and that the definition of whiteness has been shifted throughout U.S. history in order to, and that shift has had calculated negative effects on other racial groups. So I wanted to start with a quote from feminist and race scholar Linda Martin Alcott. She states that scientists in the 1990s came to the conclusion that the variety within any given racialized group provides plenty of evidence that race is not a sufficient cause of anything important, such as behavior or intelligence or moral dispositions. And I wanted to talk about this just because I wanted to talk about the concept of race before I delve specifically into whiteness. So the concept of race was only recently created in history and is based on purposefully inaccurate scientific information, some of which you can see over there. The practice of phrenology, which is parts of the skull correlating to intelligence, has been thoroughly disproven, thoroughly debunked. The origins of race are not cultural, and it is not a static biological category. So as much as we think, you know, like I'm white and that's in my DNA or whatever, that's absolutely not true. In fact, race is a tool to organize the distribution and of power and resources within a society. So a little bit about the field of whiteness studies. It's a really new field. It started in just about the 1990s. And researchers within the field of whiteness studies have come to the conclusion, or sort of come to the conclusion, that there are two main characteristics of whiteness. The first is that whiteness colonizes, appropriates, and controls the other. And the second is that it is invisible to those who participate in it. However, because this is such a new field, research is incomplete and inconsistent. And I actually take issue with the second principle, the fact that whiteness is invisible to those who participate in it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. Is whiteness invisible? Do white people know they're white? And how this has to do with holding people accountable. So ignorance is bliss. White people, sometimes it's said that we see ourselves as the default category while everyone else is the other. And there's truth in that. But to say, I think that white people are not aware of their race and status in society is not true. And this lack of awareness of whiteness allows white people to feel a sense of disconnectedness from acts of racism committed by other white people or the white population as a whole, and remain ignorant of their complicity and institutional racism, and also avoid feeling a responsibility to dismantle systemic racism and white supremacy. A little bit more about whiteness. It is a racial category, but it is also a form of property that has become to be protected under U.S. law. And what I mean by this is black people were subjugated as slaves and treated as property. If you are property, you cannot own property. If you are property, someone else owns you. So that set up a system of racialized hierarchy of ownership and power that is codified into U.S. law. Another example of this is the conquest, removal, and extermination of Native American life and culture in order to get property rights to basically the white men. And that demonstrates that only white ownership of this land was seen as legitimate, even though there were already people there living there. And also, whiteness obviously comes with societal benefits and privileges. It is a way of amassing power and advantage in society, and it is created and preserved by those in power to control who is wealthy and powerful. And whiteness is actually about power, not about skin color or ancestry, despite its historical association with skin tones typical of Western European ancestry. That's a quote from anthropologist Pam Davidson-Beck, and I think it sums up what my point is. So about the interaction between whiteness, capital, and power. The allocation of jobs to certain racial groups controls the flow of capital and privilege. So for example, if you're white or appear to be white passing, you will likely fare better in the job market than other people who do not appear to be white. And there have been studies on that where two identical resumes were sent out, one with like a white name, like John Smith or something, and like an ethnic name. I don't know how they came up with that, but and the studies, at least the majority of the time, the application with the white name was not hired because it wasn't a real application, but it was chosen, it was looked upon more favorably than that other application. Additionally, about capital and power, capitalism depends on an exploitable class of workers, which changes based on the definition of whiteness. And this benefits those considered white and harms others. For example, the Irish were seen as non-white, but then transitioned into whiteness, and I'm going to talk about that right now. So most of the literature around the shifting definition of whiteness in the US has to do with the Irish immigrant population's journey to becoming white. And this supports my argument that the boundaries of whiteness are not and have never been undefined, but are actually manipulated to benefit those considered white at the time. So before I talk a little bit more about the Irish, historian Peter Polchin came up with a way to classify waves of immigration and attitudes towards immigrants in the United States. From the 1790s to the 1840s, people were seen as black or white, essentially, and there were relatively few European immigrants. From the 1840s to the 1920s, there was a massive wave of immigration, and this led to increased prejudice against immigrant groups. And also, some groups were seen as whiter than others, which is what the term variegated whiteness means. And this is where the Irish immigrant population fits in. There are, like, you're white, you're not, but there's also some in-betweens. And from the 1920s to the present, skin color is the most important factor in determining what one's race is. And also, there's been increased immigration restriction. So when the Irish arrived in the United States, they were racialized as non-white and inferior and almost subhuman until about the 1880s. This was during that period of variegated whiteness, the middle part of that timeline that I showed in the last slide. And when the Irish immigrant population arrived, they were in competition with African Americans over manual labor jobs. And this was a source of unification for the Irish immigrant population. And also at the time, there was a considerable amount of dialogue on the crisis of whiteness, or rather, who was considered white and what that meant and what benefits they had in society. So the transition, based on much of the work in the field of whiteness studies, shows that the Irish immigrant population utilized both their positions in labor unions and in manual labor jobs, combined with outright racism, to be considered white over time. So their position in labor unions, they took over manual labor jobs. In the last slide, I said they were in competition with African Americans. They were, and ultimately the Irish were more successful in getting those jobs and then gaining power in society. And this allowed them to gain status and become a large voting bloc. And also, in addition to that, a lot of scholars believe that the Irish immigrant population used outright racism. They realized their non-whiteness and made a conscious effort to set themselves apart. They realized that being white was essential to survival. So they learned to discriminate against Black Americans as a way to counter their own oppression. And therefore the Irish's shifting of the definition of whiteness to include themselves was a calculated attempt to benefit themselves while further subjugating African Americans, which supports my point that white people know they're white, and non-white people know that they're not white, and people want to work to be white because it's better to be white in society. And once the Irish immigrant population reached whiteness, it was because the Democratic Party began to appeal to them as white men because they had become a larger voting bloc. And this allowed them to gain privilege such as better jobs, wages, and living conditions. All right, so to sum everything up, the boundaries of whiteness are not and have never been invisible. White people know that we're white. We might not talk about it, but we know. The definition of whiteness has changed throughout U.S. history to benefit those who are considered white, and these changes have had calculated negative effects on other racial groups. And the Irish becoming considered white, the transition from being subhuman and non-white to whiteness over time, is a prime example of this phenomenon.